All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I appreciate you joining us for this edition of the SEG Women's Network webinar series. Today, we have a pretty exciting topic on opportunities for geophysical innovation in support of the offshore wind energy transition. This is going to be presented by Dr. Sarah Courbis. She has been working in marine science and regulation for over 25 years. She focuses on marine protected species and specializes in impact assessment, permitting and compliance, and mitigation. Dr. Courbis is a senior scientist with Advision/Worley Group. Much of her work has been in the transition from oil and gas to renewable energy. Although there is still an important place for oil and gas in the geophysical work that is the backbone of this industry, there are vast opportunities ahead of the geophysical industry and offshore energy transition, particularly the offshore wind industry. In this presentation, Dr. Courbis will describe the status and direction of the offshore wind industry in the U.S., opportunities for geophysical innovation, and recommendations for bridging oil and gas expertise into energy transition support. Please go ahead and use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen for any questions that you might have as Dr. Courbis presents. And then we'll have some time at the end to get to as many of those questions as possible. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Courbis. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you may be. Very nice to be here. Thank you so much, Roxy, for inviting me to present today about a topic that has been very near and dear to my heart. I am very excited to see the potential for the geophysical industry in offshore wind. And I am looking forward to sharing some of the information about offshore wind and some opportunities that may be ahead for you in this exciting industry. I've put up a screen here, but I am looking at it at this angle, so it may look like I'm looking away from you a little bit, but that is where I can see the presentation, so I apologize for that. But as Roxy said, feel free to throw things into the Q&A, and at the end of the presentation, we will talk about whatever you guys want to discuss and answer your questions. So I am Sarah Courbis, as Roxy said. I work for Advision, which is part of the Worley Group. We're a large-scale engineering firm that's been very involved in offshore wind for a long time in Europe, and now has gotten engaged in the United States. My background is actually in marine sciences. I have a PhD that I used for studying marine mammals. I looked at anthropogenic impacts and population genetics of marine mammals for my master's and PhD work. So I have a scientific background myself, and more technical. I work a lot in the area of environmental compliance and mitigation planning and permit writing. So I spend a lot of time around the regulations and a lot of time looking at what it is that the folks in offshore wind need to know from their geophysical surveys and how to get those surveys permitted with reasonable mitigation measures and good planning. So I think there's a lot that the geophysical industry itself can continue to do and has already started to do to really innovate in this space. So I'd like to talk with you guys about that a little bit today. Let me see here. There we go. All right, so we will go on here. So I wanted to introduce you first to some information about offshore wind. So you may or may not be aware that offshore wind is really moving very rapidly forward in the United States. The Biden administration has set a 30 gigawatt goal for 2030. This means a pretty significant amount of development. Prior to that administration, there were several lease sales in New England and one in the New York Bight and a couple down in North Carolina. And as of this year, there were 6 leases sold. You can see in the corner here to the left, 6 leases sold in the New York Bight. There were 2 leases that were sold off of North and South Carolina, also shown here on the screen. The leases in New York Bight went for $4.37 billion with a B, the largest offshore energy lease sale in the history of the United States, including oil and gas lease sales. So this one individual set of leases was really, I think demonstrates the commitment that developers have to actually moving forward with offshore wind in the US, and the certainty that some of the states like New York have created regarding the ability of those developers to be successful there and have a market to buy that power. Now, in the context of being able to do all of this, of course, as with oil and gas, the initial stages of dealing with offshore wind development are focused on the site characterization and assessments. In addition to the net ocean data that are critically important, we also need to have the geophysical and geotechnical information that's necessary for engineering, for identification of geohazards, for identification of man-made structures and things, UXO, other things like that, looking at environment and habitat on the bottom. And of course, there are a variety of information needed for installing different types of foundations, whether they be fixed foundations, which is what we're expecting in shallower waters, or floating foundations, which involve significant mooring structures for places where the water is deeper. Some other places where there's proposed leases right now include off of California, and this is a little bit old. This is actually, they have finalized this sale notice. There will be an auction for 5 offshore wind lease blocks off the state of California's coast in December. It happens on December 6th. If you're interested, you can go on the Bowen White website that day and watch the auction happen and what people are bidding and see who wins. And there's also a call area now, and I will just describe what the call area versus wind energy area versus lease means in a subsequent slide. But at present, there's a call area off of Central Atlantic. You can see Maryland and Virginia in the center slide here. And all these little dotted lines are where there's potentially areas where leases might be set up for offshore wind. And the ones that are filled in are existing leases, so you can see where those are. Then on the right, you can see these 2 blocks that are in the top picture are actually wind energy areas that have been designated in the Gulf of Mexico. So these are sort of off the state of Texas. There's been significant interest, particularly in the state of Louisiana, as associated with their climate action planning, to get projects underway, perhaps even in some demo projects in state waters, in addition to these wind energy areas that will go up for auction. And then on the bottom right, you can see there's 2 call areas off the coast of Oregon as well. There have been a couple of unsolicited lease requests off of the coast of Washington, but the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management hasn't specified any specific sale areas there as yet, but I would expect that would be coming fairly soon. So what this looks like right now, this is a little bit of an old graphic because we're a little behind on these lease sales. So we had the 2 lease sales that are at the top, the New York Bight and Carolina Long Bay. And then that was just this year. So they sold 6, 7, 8 leases so far this year. And then not September, but in December, we will have 5 more leases sold off of California. We're expecting the Central Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico to be pushed out just a little bit, a few months later than what is indicated in here in this graphic. But you can see that there's a significant amount of areas and lease sale expected to happen over the next several years. So there's a lot of opportunity. And what happens when someone buys a lease? Well, once they've bought a lease, they need to develop that lease and they need export cables to shore. So there's a significant amount of geophysical survey necessary to understand and characterize the areas where the turbines would be installed, which, unlike oil and gas, you have hundreds of turbines, not a few structures that need to be installed across very large areas, and then cables that will run underground in the shallow waters at least, and potentially on the bottom or above the bottom for offshore in deeper areas. But all of that has to be installed and then cables to shore as well. So all of that requires information. So as a result, there are a variety of kinds of surveys that need to be conducted in order for offshore wind to move forward. And these are typically done with high resolution geophysical equipment, small scale type seismic things like boomers or sparkers for some of the deeper coverage that's necessary for certain aspects of these studies, but not the large exploratory seismic arrays that are typically applied for oil and gas exploration. And there is not a need to get as deep for assessing information for foundations of offshore wind as is necessary for identifying areas where there's oil and gas. So the equipment's a bit different. And a lot of different companies are looking at how they can optimize that equipment and optimize those kits to get the best information as fast as possible that can be used for as long as possible in the course of the project and minimize the environmental impact at the same time that they're doing that. In addition, of course, there's geotechnical sampling that needs to be done as part of this site assessment activity. And over the long term, even after turbines are in the water, there has to be survey that continues to go out there, check the integrity of systems, look at scour, understand what's going on at those foundations, and also collect data on any kind of habitat changes and things like that. So there's a long-term space here. There's not just the reconnaissance surveys that have to happen before you build the wind farm, but all the 25 years of keeping an eye on what's going on out there after it's built. And then, of course, engaging in the decommissioning process when that becomes is necessary. So this graphic kind of gives you an idea of the process that BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, undertakes. Those of you who have operated in oil and gas have familiarity with this process in the oil and gas context. There isn't an equivalent 5-year leasing plan approach to offshore wind yet. That may happen in the future as more information becomes available to BOEM about how these processes are going to go. There's a significant amount of innovation in the technology right now on the turbine side that makes it a little difficult. And the Coast Guard and other agencies are still working out what their safety requirements are, how you should configure these types of things, how you can be compatible with other ocean uses like fisheries. So this process generally starts at BOEM right now as a call for information. So BOEM will identify an area, like I showed you in that Central Atlantic planning area. That's identifying an area, a call area that could be somewhere that offshore wind could be developed. And usually that is based on interest that's been expressed by different developers. Like I mentioned, unsolicited lease requests in Washington. When a developer says, I want to develop here, then BOEM takes a look at that and says, well, is there competitive interest? And is this a place that would make sense to develop offshore wind? Is there a way this would be successful? And what do the conflicts look like? So that's the first process that they go through. And then after they identify that call area, the next step, which will happen next in the Central Atlantic call area, for example, is to create wind energy areas. So they narrow down the call area into wind energy areas, which is what you saw the picture for Gulf of Mexico. So the original call area for Gulf of Mexico is something like 30 million acres, right? And it was a large area of the Gulf of Mexico. And for the first 2 WEAs that they've decided to sell leases in, they've narrowed that down to these smaller areas off the coast of Texas through this process. Next, they do environmental assessment specifically around those wind energy areas for the purposes of leasing and ultimate site assessment, and they develop lease areas. So there'll be another, more information as they say, here's where we think we're going to put this wind energy area. Okay, give us more public feedback on what you think about this. How should we tweak it or change it? Is this a terrible spot? Is this a great spot? And they get that feedback, and then they assess where they want to put the lease blocks within, the constraints of how our leasing system is set up. There's a grid, of course, that is used for oil and gas as well. This is being applied in the same context to offshore wind. So that gridded setup, they figure out what leases they think they want and put out a proposed sale notice that describes those leases, what those leases would look like, and then again solicit feedback from folks, as well as putting out an environmental assessment that they get public comment on for doing the survey work and other site assessment that needs to happen once they've sold the leases. So once they get through all that process, they produce what's called the final sale notice, which is what is currently out for California's wind areas. They have now defined the leases, told you when they're going to have the lease sale and what the parameters are around the sale, and then they proceed to market and have an auction. And once the auction is complete, the companies that have won the auction are vetted by BOEM, and as long as everything is copacetic and the money is there, then they issue these leases usually within a few months of the end of the sale. And that is when, during that time frame, is when a lot of the winners are going to start in earnest going out and soliciting for survey planning and survey activities, some of which involve permits that take a little time to get out there on the water, but some of which can be done fairly quickly, and you can get out there reasonably fast to collect data. The interesting thing about that is that, you know, a lot of these areas have some pre-existing data, of course, but not necessarily tons of it. So they're kind of flying a little blind on the geophysical survey side of these types of things, and hoping that they don't end up in a situation where they're going to have difficulty installing moorings or putting in foundations or things like that. And as I noted, you know, there's construction and operations pieces to this too that involve geophysical work during construction and then subsequently to monitor all of these. And generally an operational wind farm, you take it from lease sale to building the wind farm is supposed to be something in around a 5-year process to get all of your approvals and what have you, and do your site assessments, and then you would build your wind farm. So you expect these things to ideally be operational. Certainly you hope within 10 years of having had the lease sale, and ideally faster, particularly with the goals that have been set for offshore wind development. And then those wind farms will operate for 25 years or so. And there may be repowering or decommissioning or other things that need to happen later on in that process. But meanwhile, all of these things need to be surveyed. So this is kind of just a real basic graphic to kind of summarize what I just said. You know, you have call areas identified, those are turned into wind energy areas, and then lease areas, all through public process. BOEM engages in interagencies task forces with the states that are relevant, that would have coastal considerations and that might buy the power, and then goes through the process of public comment on all these different things. And at the context of construction operations planning, they do a full environmental impact statement that assesses the potential for environmental and socioeconomic impacts, as well as working out mitigation plans and determining where there's user conflict and how to address that. So all that stuff goes in there, but they have specific guidances about what information they need from the geophysical and geotechnical side of things in order to approve the plans for construction and operations of the wind farm. So some areas where geophysical information can be really helpful. Up in the upfront part of this, BOEM has started doing what is called suitability modeling. So initially, a wind developer would just say to BOEM, like in California as an example, they might say, we want to put a wind farm here, or they've done in Washington, we want to put a wind farm here. So then BOEM has to go out and sort of say, is there commercial interest in this? And is this a place that we can viably, you know, build offshore wind farms based on a variety of different reasons, including what, you know, the engineering looks like and what the, you know, geophysical and geotechnical conditions may be, as one of many things that they consider. But more recently, they have been naming these call areas like the Central Atlantic call area or the Gulf of Mexico call area, sort of upfront, where you have an expression of interest by developers, but then you kind of take a large area that could be satisfactory for offshore wind development, and then you do a process by which you do suitability modeling. So you look at what are the hazards, what are the biological resources there, what are the user conflicts with, say, fisheries or tourism or what have you, what is the actual, you know, wind speeds and parameters that are associated with, you know, a successful wind project, where are the points of interconnection, all these kinds of things. What is the national defense issue? Does DoD have operations there? You know, and they overlay all of that into suitability modeling to look for the most suitable locations, the least conflicted locations that still have the parameters necessary for successful wind farms in a certain area. So geophysical information can be really important to informing that when we have such information, and could even potentially, you know, make an area, understanding the risk, right, of developing in a particular area because of, say, seismicity or other issues is really important. The West Coast is a good example of this, where the area that the Morro Bay wind lease areas are in is actually a pretty complex bottom environment with a lot of pockmarking and various slides, and so obviously there's seismicity off the West Coast. So there's a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration in what is the risk, how much is this going to cost. I mean, you can engineer your way out of almost anything, but it becomes, you know, more and more expensive the more challenging the environment. So all that information is really important to understanding where should we develop these projects. And you can see a picture here in the bottom in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this is actually a picture from an aquaculture suitability analysis, not from the offshore wind analysis, because they don't have that published in the public space yet. But the this aquaculture analysis is the same idea. So the redder areas are unsuitable based on a layered analysis of the sustainability model described up above here with these different things in industry navigation, cultural resources, and natural resources, user conflicts. If there's a constraint that you just absolutely couldn't do that there, like let's say it's too deep, or it's below a certain wind speed, or the DoD says absolutely not, there's no way you can operate there. So there can be things that say, well, you just can't be there. And then national security is also a separate thing where there might be some areas where there's some national security concerns, but DoD feels like they could work around it. So what are the opportunities around this? So there's a lot going on and a lot of information that people need in order to have successful projects. And a lot of people's, when it comes down to offshore wind, it's all about cost and schedule. And that's probably true of any sort of development. But right now in offshore wind, nobody's actually making any money until they get that steel in the water and start selling that power to somewhere in the US, or converting it to hydrogen, or whatever they're going to do, but they have to be able to sell the power. That's how they're going to make their money. So anything that can speed up their process to steel in the water is something that's going to be really, really important to them. So some of the things that I think are useful are thinking about how geophysical industry can develop innovative solutions to de-risk projects and to provide the information that people need. And that can come before the lease sale or after the lease sale. In the pre-lease sale context, I think there are opportunities potentially for what's sort of a multi-client kind of concept. When BOEM says, here's a wind energy area, they're effectively saying, we're going to put leases here, and whatever information is available already that's publicly available is available, but more nuanced, specific information that might be useful to de-risking the project or understanding what the potential risks are in thinking about how much money you want to spend on a given lease, or even if you want to bid on a given lease, is information that people don't necessarily have in certain areas. So there can be opportunities to collect data and sell it to multiple clients who might want to bid on those leases, but want more information to help them make a better informed choice. During the construction itself, of course, again, there's surveys needed pre-construction, and then during construction and post-construction. And all of these things are asking slightly different questions, right? So one of the things that's been a challenge is the sort of the transition from oil and gas to offshore wind is you don't really want to take the equipment you're using for oil and gas purposes and try to plunk it into the offshore wind space. And there have been a number of companies that have been innovating in this area. You need to look at, what are the questions you're trying to answer? What is the information you actually need? And how can you optimize your equipment, like what kind of equipment you're using, your kit, to collect the information that's needed so that the data are able to meet all of the guidance requirements on understanding things like archaeological or habitat data, as well as the engineering needs, and have the best longevity through the project, can be the most useful over time. Because there might be, if you have to go out and do multiple surveys, that takes a lot of time. If there's something you can do that optimizes it so you get data that lasts longer, it gives you more information into the future of your project, that can be really helpful. So I think these early collaborations with some of the engineers and regulators to look at like purpose-built kits and really, getting at those questions, while also making sure that you're creating kits and developing and adjusting equipment in ways that will not substantively increase your impacts on the environment or the challenges associated with permitting, such as Marine Mammal Protection Act permitting, which can be very difficult to get, and it takes time, and that is very based on sound. Right now, it is based on sound received levels by animals. So things that have lower sound sources, that have narrower beams, stuff like that, can be really helpful in reducing the burden associated with some of the permitting. So it's not something that should be done in a silo or a vacuum. And I think the engineers and the regulators and the scientists that understand the impacts and the relationship to regulation and such, everybody has to kind of get together and look at, what are our best options here. Another thing that people are doing a lot with now are autonomous technologies. And I think that's going to be really valuable. But here again, there are certain permitting constraints around them. So working out how can we get around some of these permitting constraints, and that requires some vetting by the agencies and the regulators as well. So if you're developing innovative technologies and coming up with new ideas, it's good to get them in front of people, get them out there, and particularly in front of the regulators, and look at how they interact with the regulatory frameworks to make sure you're not, making it more difficult. A lot of developers are very risk averse, and again, their timeline is so important to them that if you have a great idea and a really cool innovation in geophysical science, they may be hesitant to adopt it because they're worried that the regulators might, not know about it or understand it, and it will delay their permitting processes, for example. So it's really important to have that dialogue with everybody involved and the stakeholders as well. And I think it's important to bear in mind that it's not just in the US that wind is taking off in the offshore space. Of course, it's been prevalent in Europe for a long time, but South America, Canada, Australia, Asia, other parts of the world are developing offshore wind now too, and making commitments to offshore wind. So I think the area of geophysical innovation is going to be much broader than just what we're doing here in the US. There are some challenges associated with doing geophysical work. And, as I noted, there's permitting that is required for sound sources in the water at certain sound source levels. And there's some history that we can learn from, and also that we want to be careful about using where it's not applicable in the oil and gas industry. There is, as I said, a need for some level of vetting of new technologies among the regulators and stakeholders to have a level of comfort and feel confident that you can get the data that you need, and that you're minimizing your impacts to the environment, for example. There's also some issues with the guidance, so there's a lot of guidances, and I do have a slide that kind of lists some of those out. But the guidance, the guidances that have been put together by BOEM and NIMS and other regulators generally are focused on the US East Coast for our US guidances, right? So that's where development has happened so far. So translating that to the West Coast or the Gulf Coast may be challenging, and trying to understand what are the data you really need, and what are the equipment you need to collect those data in these other regions where, like, you're using floating foundations, for example, in the offshore space on the West Coast, versus all of the stuff on the East Coast so far has been fixed foundations. So there's just it's different equipment and different needs. And there's also various commitments that developers are making, and the intention is to create a renewable energy source that does, in fact, minimize the impacts to the environment. It's a little, and they have a lot of ENGO stakeholders that are very tied to that, as they should be. It is, and as a marine scientist, I think it is really important that we make our development offshore sustainable. So that means that some developers are making various types of commitments in their power purchase agreements, or in their construction operations plans, or in their permits that may be beyond what you're used to seeing in oil and gas, or that even the regulatory framework would require. So we need to be able to provide those folks with the equipment and the survey plans and the information that they need to be able to meet those types of commitments and end up with the most responsible project that they can have as they develop moving forward. So I think that my main recommendation that comes out of that is just that there are some challenges. Innovation can be hard, and getting people on board with it and believing in what you're putting forward as being valuable and something that you can get through the permitting processes is important. So that early engagement with the agencies and the developers, so that you can optimize that, as well as thinking about what these other stakeholders and the general environmental considerations are, and how it and social justice, right? So there's this particular administration has focused a lot on social justice and has a couple of executive orders out regarding environmental justice issues. But I think that's reflective of society, not coming really from the administration itself. I think a lot of us are very interested in trying to make sure that projects that develop offshore are developed not only responsibly from an environmental perspective, but also not, basically creating the best advantage for environmental justice communities and disadvantaged businesses and things like that. We want that to be a part of the offshore wind industry. So here are some resources, like I said, that are guidance documents that kind of give you an idea of what BOEM is asking people to do in when they collect data, when they go out and do geophysical survey work. So this can inform the kinds of information that people will need after the fact, once they buy a lease, so you can see what it is that they have to produce in order to set up their construction operations plan. And as I said, it is more than just the information needed for engineering the turbines. So it's really important to understand the nexus across all the different information requirements that BOEM and other implementing agencies need in order to move the projects forward in a timely manner. And then finally, I wanted to quick touch on some things about oil and gas and the relationship there, because obviously we have a huge history in the geophysical industry of working in oil and gas. And I think that history and that experience really is important to bring to the table in discussing what we do moving forward with offshore wind. There's a lot of knowledge about how to set up surveys and the workflows and the data management and data sharing and data processing. All these types of things are really going to be incredibly important. That analytical capability in the geophysical industry is something that a lot of other industries do not have. They don't work with these giant data sets and develop these valuable algorithms and things to go through. Like this is a process everybody's kind of starting up, and things more like if you're going to go out and do a survey for marine mammals, we used to do them for 1 week a year in this spot. Now we're trying to do this every month for 2 weeks of the month, and there's so much data, and it's actually really challenging to get. Everybody can't just eyeball the data, like have a person looking at everything anymore. You've got to develop algorithms, you've got to develop data storage capacity, you've got to develop systems that can send data via satellite. It's very complicated. And the geophysical industry has actually been doing a lot of these things for many years and can really, I think, bring a lot to the table there. There's also a lot of data that just exists because they've been collected already. So particularly the Gulf of Mexico is a good example. I've got a picture here of some of the publicly available information about infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's been a lot of survey work done in some parts of the US that you could take existing data and analyze it to answer questions and de-risk projects for folks who are looking at buying offshore wind. Some of the differences in what the types of things we need to know for offshore wind that from the oil and gas industry. Obviously, where you develop is different. You're developing where there's a wind resource rather than an oil and gas resource. So there are some locational differences. And of course, the East and West Coast are looking to have rather substantial development in offshore wind, which was not the case with oil and gas. So there's some new environments where we don't have as much data that we need to learn more about. The size and scale is really different. You can see this picture on the bottom. I mean, a wind farm can be hundreds of turbines, maybe based on what we've been looking at on the East Coast, approximately a nautical mile apart from each other with corridors for vessels and things like that. But it's a lot compared to a few structures that might be used for oil and gas at one time. So this type of scale and the amount of survey area that's involved in this, plus all of the cable laying, and all these turbines have to be connected to each other or a substation in some way, like the power has to flow from all of these to somewhere and then to shore. So there's quite a bit of cable that in a lot of cases is buried or will be buried and that requires a lot of information before you do that. I think so that kind of is the underpinning reasons that there are some different data needs. Typically the depth at which you need information is much shallower too, because again, you're not looking for oil and gas. So for the comparison with like an exploration survey, it's not really similar. So you need to have equipment that you don't want to use equipment that's way beyond what's necessary in order to get the information that you need. And there's a lot of folks who are asking for innovation and are looking for new ways to collect data. And a lot of companies are thinking about how can I reconfigure equipment, or what kinds of different sources can I use to get the best spread and the best information. And make those data have longevity, as we talked about before. So some things that would be useful in the world of innovation are on this page. I don't want to read all of those to you, but I do think that there's a lot of room to improve the kits that we're using right now. And I give kudos to those who have been working out what we're doing in offshore wind as it is developing on the East Coast. There has been a lot of innovation very quickly, including, as I noted, the autonomous equipment. Things that can go out there on their own and don't need to have people on board to collect information that we need. But there's certainly much more that can be done. And as I said, that finding ways to collect those data in the sort of the least amount of time, but with the best, the most longevity of those data through the course of the construction and operations planning is something that I think is really critical to timelines. And optimizing, what kind of site characterization you're doing with geotechnical is also something, the geophysical information can help. And then the long-term, of course, like I said, there's going to be long-term monitoring. And one thing that would be really helpful is to incorporate the geophysical survey activities for long-term monitoring into the environmental long-term monitoring, and using the vessels and things as platforms of opportunity to be able to collect information and service equipment that's out there for collecting data on environmental impacts and things like that. So there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration, I think, in this space as well. So some examples of what this has looked like to this point. This is just a few examples. There are obviously many more folks who are doing innovative work. So I don't, I'm not leaving anybody out on purpose, but I just wanted to show a couple of things here. With some of the autonomous vehicles that we're seeing, some of the new and different types of spreads and ways to, so in this case of the thing in the middle where you put things closer to the bottom, that can help reduce your potential to affect animals where you're not putting as much sound in the water column, for example. This autonomous vehicle on the right here can carry a payload of a variety of different types of sensors and acoustic equipment. Although at this point, the autonomous vehicles cannot have the boomers and sparkers and the seismic type equipment on it without some, that needs some work on the permitting side of the house. Anybody who has an interest in that, I'm super interested in that, and I would really like to help folks figure out a way to get that permit issue moved forward with equipment that normally you would need protected species observers to watch. Is why you can't just let it be autonomous. You have to have someone watching it so they can shut down the equipment when certain animals are within certain distances. But I suspect that that's something that could also be automated, given the right innovations. So I would really very much like to talk to people who are interested in that. Another example here is actually in mid-ocean buoy data collection. I think that I didn't really talk much about that because we're talking geophysical here, but geophysical companies like TGS in this example are also engaged, in the data collection business. And again, the idea that you can go out, you can collect, in this case, potentially, again, multi-client type data, and use the expertise and experience that you have in the geophysical industry and the ability to manage large data sets, organize them, mine them for information, share them and package them in ways that are useful. It's a really important capability that the geophysical industry has developed over a very long time and really can be used to advantage beyond just doing geophysical surveys, as this example indicates. So that's my sort of overview of what's coming in offshore wind, what some of the innovations are that we need, some relationship to the oil and gas industry and how we might leverage that, and some examples of innovative ideas that folks have had recently. And with that, I'd like to open it up to questions, and I will answer them as I can. And feel free, my email address is up there. You can certainly get in touch with me after this if you want to talk with me further. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. As I stated before, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom there. For whatever reason, I guess the platform we use, we can't unmute attendees. So please go ahead and just use that Q&A feature. I have not seen anything come through unless I am mistaken, which is possible.
We can give people a minute to digest. That was a lot of information.
It was. Um, do you anticipate all of the offshore wind leases, all these lease sales that you've mentioned that's coming up in California and Gulf of Mexico, et cetera? Do you expect similar similar sales, I guess, as far as with the New York one, there was, you're saying billion with a B. Are you expecting similar prices for those for the future lease sales, or do you think New York was just a special case?
Well, that's a good point, in that I do think the answer is kind of yes to both of those. It's not really an either or here in a sense, because New York is a bit of a special flower because they did a lot of de-risking for developers. They spent a lot of time, they made a master plan, they collected all kinds of data, they paid for whale surveys, turtle surveys, bird surveys, all kinds of stuff, and made it very clear that they are going to buy that power, right? So they have a structure in place and have announced when they plan to have competitive sales for for buying power from these offshore wind farms. So states that are doing things to de-risk are going to be states that have higher dollars go for their leases. I think the highest one went for 1.1 billion in that 6th lease sale. Now, subsequent to that, they did a lease sale for a couple of lease blocks off of the North Carolina, South Carolina area there. And I'm trying to remember that they were not up to $1 billion. Neither of those leases went as high as that. As probably somewhere in the like $500 to $700 million mark, like over $500,000, but not all the way up to $1 billion. I suspect that the leases will go for more off of California than they did off of North Carolina, just because the population center and the ability to, like, if you can get that power to shore, when you get that power to shore, although there are plenty of transmission and other issues that folks need to work out, but when you get that power to shore, you have a large economy and a large state with a lot of people that you're servicing. So I think those have value. In the Gulf of Mexico, the wind isn't as strong in the area of the Gulf of Mexico as it is in the West and East Coast. So that maybe reduces the value somewhat, but Louisiana has made it very clear that they will purchase power and they're in it. So the more Louisiana de-risks that investment, the more likely people are to spend more money on it. So I would suspect that we wouldn't necessarily see a lot of lease blocks go for $1 billion moving forward, but we're definitely going to see them going for over $500,000 for most of these, I would expect.
Okay, great, good to know. Okay, so we have gotten several questions now in the Q&A box, so I'm going to just go through those. Rocio asks, is then the geophysical work for aeolic energy similar to the geohazards geophysics for offshore oil and gas development?
There are some similarities and some differences. So we're using a lot of the same types of pieces of equipment that you use for certain aspects of oil and gas survey work. As I noted, you don't need to use the big, like the 5,000 cubic inch array kind of stuff. The sort of thing that you would use for exploration surveys, no, but the sort of things that you would use on lease to look at what you're doing there, yes. But you need much more of it because you're putting out 100 or 200 turbines rather than a few structures. So the coverage that's required also involves it's shallower, but a lot more. And then the archaeological requirements that BOEM's been putting into place for, like, I guess they said the other day that they're kind of cutting that off at 200 meters, but in less than 200 meters of water, which is all that you're dealing with on the East Coast up till you get to the edge of the shelf there, requires that you penetrate at least 10 meters below wherever your structure is going to be under the ground. So whether it's the foundations or the cables, you have to get below that to look for cultural resources. So the equipment has to be capable of doing that, but I don't think that's entirely the same as their requirements associated with oil and gas. But it's on the East Coast, you have an area that was exposed to it was land at one time. So that's why they're kind of really intense about those requirements on the East Coast. And then NIMS and BOEM have developed a set of requirements around, and I say requirements, they're really guidance documents. If there's some reason that you think something different, you can always argue the point, but they want habitat information to help inform essential fish habitat consultation processes with the fisheries service. So there are certain data that they want collected with the geophysical surveys that that differs from the guidance associated with oil and gas, like notices to lessees kind of stuff. And there's different types of habitat that you need to get information about somewhere like California than you would in the Gulf of Mexico, let's say. So there are definitely some similarities in particularly the equipment and things that you're adapting from using the on-lease equipment, basically the HRG survey equipment, to another context. But there's information you need for offshore wind that does differ from oil and gas.
Okay, so kind of some along those lines, are there other kinds of long-term modeling that you would expect to see aside from things like impact on ecosystems, but are there other long-term like modeling for focal points?
That's a good question. I do think that the developers themselves are looking for modeling that helps inform the structural integrity and the ability to make sure that what they're installing, these are sort of new in a way. Like some of the foundations have been used obviously successfully in Europe for a long time, but the engineering needs for the US are a little different, or like hurricane proofing, for example, is something that's they're working on it, for the turbines, of course, in the Gulf of Mexico particularly. But the need to kind of understand how to best engineer these structures in the environment, and they're much larger now. Like even just over the last few years, the size of these structures and the turbines, the turbines themselves, and thereby the foundations that are necessary to hold these turbines have gotten much larger. So I do think that there's an interest in modeling also from an engineering perspective and incorporating those details into the structural integrity models for just even the design of the wind farms.
Okay. All right, we have another question on data processing requirements related to size or complexity of these algorithms. Like with oil and gas, is compute power ever really a constraint, would you expect?
Yeah, it is. So that's why it's helpful to get folks like, those in the geophysical industry engaged, because, you've been using large data sets that necessitate algorithms to find information and help identify things in them. That is something that has not been as common in some of the other aspects of industry. But now when you're talking about very large areas, you're talking about hundreds of turbines in a given project, you really have very big data sets, and trying to manage that. Right now, there's a number of organizations that are working to try to develop data standards for different types of data, including the geophysical data and how it can be shared when it's possible to share it, because of course there's certainly proprietary, sometimes commercially sensitive information associated with those data. But the idea is that you don't want to sit on someone's shelf, and then if that company goes out of business or whatever, like you've lost all those data, they're not there anymore. So trying to figure out ways that we can use those data in other studies. Geohazard type data, for example, can be helpful in planning and risk assessment, even aside from just whether or not you can put a turbine in that spot. So yeah, I do think computing power has been a challenge. Right now, like as an example of this, on the East Coast, the state of New York did surveys for animals. They did digital aerial surveys. So this is a relatively new technology, not only new technology, but a new application of the technology of digital aerial survey work. And so it's hard to integrate it into historical survey approaches and look at trends, but then they actually looked at all those data by hand. Every picture was looked at by a human being, not an algorithm that helped pick out where there might be marine mammals or fish or something in this picture, right? Or birds. We're still at sort of in a nascent stage in many cases in developing the algorithms to like the target algorithms we really need. on in the environmental side when we get these gigantic data sets and we don't have the historical resources to process those data sets or hold those data sets or share those data sets or create the metadata for those data sets in a timely, convenient way. So these are innovations that I think could come in part from the geophysical industry, where you're very used to dealing with large data and could work together with other folks collecting different kinds of data sets and integrate those data sets and serve them up in platforms. There's a lot of data portals right now. And I don't think we're going to consolidate them into one or anything. There's just going to be a lot of data portals. But I think we can use them to advantage to make data available in formats that people can download from those data portals and use to figure out answers to questions associated with offshore wind development. And like I said before too, there also is the potential for commercial opportunity there. If you're collaborating and collecting data with someone else and helping them, that's something that developers are going to pay for, that type of support. That's not something that you're just giving away. So I think there are some opportunities in the big data management area for geophysical scientists as well.
So, so you do see like a time maybe when developers or somebody would be leasing data from oil and gas operators or similar service companies, like you were mentioning TGS before, but then also seeing the maybe in the future, combined surveys for both oil and gas and offshore wind development.
I think that's quite feasible, particularly, in Gulf of Mexico. And the big oil developers are also, many of them, not all of them, are involved in offshore wind as well. Shell, Total, Equinor, BP, or some of like the big guys who have spent money on leases. They have offshore wind leases. They're going to be, they have a history and experience working with different geophysical companies. And there is an interest in trying to consolidate a little, and aquaculture is another one to keep in mind. So, these aquaculture opportunity areas that are being evaluated in the Gulf of Mexico and offshore of Southern California. To install aquaculture, you also need to collect geophysical data and for the engineering and environmental purposes. And there's talk about, well, could we integrate some of these things together? Can we do offshore wind with aquaculture in the wind farm? Even in the Gulf of Mexico, you could see where you might repurpose oil and gas structures. A lot of folks are saying, well, if we don't have to decommission a structure, if we could repurpose it in some way to operate in support of offshore wind, that would be a good alternative. And it's something that it's a win-win. The people who have that structure out there can, repurpose it and continue to make some kind of money off of it. And, you don't have to go through a whole process of removing things from the Gulf of Mexico. So these are sort of nascent, these ideas are people are circulating and talking about, and how can we integrate the oil and gas industry that's already quite large in the Gulf of Mexico into the context of offshore wind, aquaculture, and other types of development. But yeah, I do see a nexus there. So, if you're collecting data for oil and gas, thinking about how could these data help to inform other industries, and who else might want to buy these data. If I'm doing multi-client, say you are doing an exploration survey, and you want to sell that information to wind developers because you think, if you think you really need to know what the wind looks like. And there are some studies, in the Gulf generically, but putting out a few buoys to see what the mid-ocean conditions look like, and then tying that to, geophysical information, you might have some additional clients, and they can go to BOEM and say, we're interested in this area. This has good wind, and the data tell us that this is a place where we could build a wind farm and be successful.
Great. There are several more questions, but I think we only really have time for one more. So I'm just going to reiterate that Sarah did mention she's available via email. So if you do want to get your question answered, please go ahead and send her an email. But the last question that I did want to make sure we could touch on here was a question regarding any sort of guess or speculation you might have as far as what the differences that BOEM guidelines might have for with East Coast versus West Coast versus Gulf of Mexico, et cetera.
That also is it's a hard one. They're still in the process of developing and updating guidelines. So there's some guidelines that they've put out for the East Coast, like the archaeological requirements, where they're telling us now, well, on the West Coast, they might only extend those guidelines to certain depths because you wouldn't expect that there would be human habitation in places that, you know, weren't historically uncovered. So some of the guidance documents I expect to change. The habitat data, I think it'll be really similar between Gulf of Mexico and East Coast, but when you get into these really deep waters on the slope and abyss of off California and Oregon and Washington, the type of data you need and the type of habitats that matter, you know, would be different. So I would expect to see some different guidance around that. There's been mitigation type guidance that NOAA has put out that's kind of, you know, useful to take a look at and understand sort of what are the concerns that NIMS has and how do they want to regulate the geophysical industry. Or it's not really regulatory in a sense, like they're not adding more statutory authorities, but they're kind of, you know, showing you their cards and saying, you know, here's what we think is a problem and what kinds of mitigation we consider, you know, in terms of projects. And you can think about that and like, how is that if there's certain mitigation, like shutdown mitigations, for example, for certain animals at certain distances. I think the oil and gas industry in the Gulf is a good place for us to understand where we can expect that for marine mammals and sea turtles, at least, and understanding, well, okay, how can I develop equipment that's going to minimize the impact of mitigation on the project too, not just collect the data, but be the best situation to have the minimum number of shutdowns or whatever that we can possibly have. So some things won't be in that won't be a guidance that somebody comes up with. That's actually something you've got to think of. Like, this has got to be part of my goal in developing these technologies and innovating, you know, new ways to do this. But I do think they'll make some shifts in some of the guidance over time. But they're in such a hurry right now too to kind of get this stuff up and running so that we can actually meet some of these goals for 2030. That I think it's going to require that people who want to be innovators in this space should be communicating directly with the agencies and not waiting for updated guidance to come out so that they can understand what the policy is in these people's heads. They may not get it all on paper before, you know, they'll have some policy in their mind, but they won't necessarily get it all down in a guidance before you're going to want to be out there collecting data, is sort of I don't know. I think that's my opinion. Obviously, anything I'm telling you here is my opinion from my experience, and I may be wrong, but I don't think they're going to get a lot of guidance documents updated in time for the first surveys people want to do off California coast, for example.
Okay, great. Again, I want to mention, you know, Sarah said that she is available via email, and she is sarah.courbis@advision.com. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you, Sarah, for presenting. This was very informative with a lot of interesting discussion there. Please join us next month for the November presentation on salt and geophysics on Mars. Thank you all, and hope to see you again in November. Thanks.